Right now, in this very moment, there is a conversation happening inside you that you have not chosen, that you did not design, and that has been quietly writing the next chapter of your life while you were busy looking outward for the cause of your circumstances. I want you to pause and notice it. Not the words I am speaking to you, but the other voice, the one that runs beneath your days like an underground stream, commenting, rehearsing, arguing, explaining, defending. That voice, my friends, is not idle chatter. It is the loom upon which your entire future is being woven, thread by thread. And tonight I want to show you how to take the shuttle out of habit's careless hand and place it back into your own, so that what you weave from this night forward is chosen, not inherited. You have been taught, perhaps without ever being told so plainly, that your outer world is the primary reality, and your inner world merely a private commentary upon it, a kind of running narration that changes nothing, affects nothing, and simply reflects what is already fixed and settled outside you. I want to overturn that belief completely tonight, because it is precisely backward. The inner conversation is the cause. The outer circumstance is only the echo. And an echo, however loud it seems, however convincing, is never more than the faithful repetition of a sound first made elsewhere. If you have been listening to your circumstances as though they were the original voice, no wonder you have felt so powerless to change them. You were listening to the echo and mistaking it for the speaker. Let me describe to you what happens in a deep canyon when a single word is spoken. The sound travels outward, strikes the distant walls of rock, and returns to the speaker moments later, sometimes so clearly that a traveler unfamiliar with the phenomenon might believe another voice out there in the wilderness had spoken those very words back to him. But he need only remain silent, and the canyon falls silent with him. He need only change his word, and the canyon obediently returns the new one instead. Your life is such a canyon, my friends, vast and reflective, and every circumstance that greets you, whether it is the tone in which your employer speaks to you, the ease or difficulty with which money arrives, the warmth or coldness you encounter in strangers, is simply the return of a word you have been speaking, over and over, in the private canyon of your own mind, so habitually that you have long forgotten you are the one speaking it at all. I ask you now, honestly, what word have you been speaking into that canyon? When you imagine the conversation you must have tomorrow with someone who has power over your circumstances, do you rehearse confidence, or do you rehearse apology before any wrong has even been committed? When you imagine opening an email, do you brace in advance for bad news? When you picture your own future, even in idle daydream while waiting for a kettle to boil or a light to change, do you find yourself constructing scenes of struggle, delay, and disappointment, dressed up as mere realism? I tell you, this is the inner conversation, and it is not commentary, it is composition. It is the actual writing of your next circumstance, performed so habitually, so unconsciously, that you have mistaken it for simple observation of a world that seems to exist independently of you. Let us go back to the very foundation of this teaching, so that everything I say afterward rests upon solid ground rather than sand. Imagination is not a lesser cousin of reality, a pale shadow cast by the more substantial light of the physical world. Imagination is the creative power itself, the very substance from which all visible things first take their invisible shape. Exactly as a house exists, first in the mind of the architect, fully formed in every measurement and material, long before a single stone is laid upon another. Consciousness is the only reality, and everything you call the outer world, every relationship, every circumstance, every dollar or lack of it, is simply consciousness in a particular state, made visible, the way ice is simply water in a particular state, made solid enough to hold in your hand. And feeling, my friends, feeling is the secret ingredient that determines which state you are truly in, regardless of what words you may be consciously repeating on the surface. This is where I must correct a common and costly error. Many who have heard of this law believe that changing their outer life is a matter of controlling their thoughts, forcing positive words to the front of the mind through sheer discipline. But thought alone, unaccompanied by feeling, is like a seed scattered upon the surface of hardened winter ground, visible perhaps for a moment, but never taking root, never reaching the deeper soil where true growth begins. It is your inner conversation, not your isolated thoughts, that carries the feeling capable of reaching that deeper soil. Because a conversation, unlike a single thought, has momentum, has continuity, has the emotional weight of something rehearsed and therefore believed. This is why rewiring that inner conversation, rather than merely correcting a stray thought here and there, is the fastest and most direct path to changing your entire experience. Consider how a river carves its bed. It is not a single drop of water that shapes the stone, but the ceaseless, repeated passage of countless drops, moving along the same path, day after day, year after year, until the stone itself yields and a permanent channel is formed. Your inner conversation is exactly this ceaseless passage. Every time you rehearse, in the privacy of your own mind, a conversation of scarcity, of being overlooked, of bracing for disappointment, you send another drop of water along that same channel, deepening it, until it becomes the natural and almost inevitable course your life takes. Not because life itself demanded it, but because you yourself carved the bed through which it now flows. I want you to consider the story of a man who spent years imagining, in vivid and habitual detail, the exact moment his creditors would finally corner him, rehearsing their words, rehearsing his own stammering excuses, feeling in his very stomach the shame of that imagined confrontation, though it had not yet occurred even once. He believed he was simply being prudent, preparing himself for a possible hardship. But he was not preparing for hardship. He was manufacturing it, drop by drop, in the private canyon of his mind, until the day arrived, almost as if summoned by an appointment he himself had scheduled. And the very scene he had rehearsed so faithfully played out before him in the visible world, each word so familiar he could have spoken his creditor's lines himself. Because in truth, he already had, 100 times over, in the theater of his own imagination. Now let me tell you of another, who caught herself in precisely this habit, and chose deliberately to rewrite the play before it ever reached the stage. Each evening, rather than rehearsing the anxious conversation she feared having with her landlord about the rent she could not yet see how to pay, she began instead to imagine a different conversation entirely, one in which she handed over the payment with the same unremarkable calm she might use to hand over payment for her morning bread. No drama, no gratitude performed for an audience. Simply the plain and settled fact of a debt paid, because the means to pay it were, in her private and persistent feeling, already present. She did not know how the money would arrive. She only knew, with growing and quiet certainty, that the conversation she was now rehearsing was the one she intended to make real, and within a matter of weeks, through a channel she could never have devised by reason alone, the means arrived, and the very conversation she had imagined played out almost word for word in her landlord's own kitchen. Do you see now why the title of tonight's message speaks of rewiring, and not merely of thinking more positively? A wire, once shaped and set, does not change its form through occasional and half-hearted adjustment. It must be deliberately bent, held in its new shape, and given time to remember that shape as its natural resting state. Your inner conversation is precisely such a wire, bent over years into a particular shape by careless repetition, and it will not be reshaped by a single burst of enthusiasm on a single evening. It requires the same patient, deliberate bending, held consistently, until the new shape becomes, as it were, the wire's own memory, its natural and effortless posture, no longer requiring conscious effort to maintain. Let me speak now of the state akin to sleep, for it is here that the deepest and most lasting rewiring of this inner conversation takes place, more powerfully than at any other hour of your day. You know the moment I mean. That drowsy threshold, just before sleep fully claims you, when the busy, arguing, analytical portion of your mind has finally grown quiet, the way a marketplace grows quiet as evening falls, and the merchants pack away their stalls one by one. In that hush, the deeper mind lies open and unguarded, and whatever conversation you rehearse in that state sinks far beneath the surface, past the watchman of doubt who stands so vigilantly guarding the gates during your waking hours. This is why I ask you tonight, before sleep takes you, to deliberately construct the inner conversation you wish to make real, not as an abstract wish spoken in isolation, but as a natural exchange, imagined vividly, felt fully, between yourself and another, concerning the very thing you desire, as though it had already, quietly and without fanfare, come to pass. Perhaps you desire a particular kind of recognition in your work. Do not merely imagine a vague sense of success. Imagine the actual words a colleague might say to you, congratulating you, and imagine your own reply, calm, gracious, unsurprised, because you already knew within that this recognition was simply the natural outer expression of a state you had long ago claimed as your own. Perhaps you desire reconciliation with someone from whom you have grown distant. Do not merely wish for peace between you in vague and general terms. Imagine the specific tone of their voice, softened. Imagine the particular words that would signal the old wound has healed. Imagine your own response, warm and without bitterness, and let this imagined conversation carry you gently across the threshold into sleep, so that it becomes the last impression left upon your mind before the analytical watchman relinquishes his post for the night. I must speak now of persistence, because even the most vividly imagined conversation, held once and then abandoned, is like a single drop of water striking dry stone and evaporating before it can ever begin to carve a channel. The old conversation, the one that has run for years, possesses a kind of momentum that will not surrender to a single night's effort. It will return, often at the most inconvenient moments, whispering its old and familiar script, just when you believed you had already left it behind. This is not failure. This is simply the nature of an old and deeply worn channel, still present, still available to the water of your attention, even after you have begun to carve a new one nearby. Your task, whenever you notice the old conversation attempting to reassert itself, is not to fight it with anger or frustration, for anger and frustration are themselves simply another form of the old conversation, still centered on struggle rather than ease. Your task is simply to notice gently and to return, without self-reproach, to the new conversation you have chosen, the way a patient teacher returns a wandering child's attention to the lesson at hand, again and again, without ever raising his voice, trusting that repetition, calmly applied, accomplishes what force never could. I think of the ancient image of a potter at the wheel, shaping wet clay with steady, patient hands. If the potter grows frustrated the moment the clay wobbles off its intended shape and abandons the wheel entirely, no vessel will ever be formed. But if the potter simply, calmly, returns his hands to the clay each time it wanders, correcting gently without drama, a vessel takes form, slowly, through nothing more dramatic than steady and patient return. This is precisely how your inner conversation must be handled. Every time it wobbles back toward the old familiar shape of lack or fear, you simply return your attention calmly to the new conversation you are shaping, and over days and weeks, though you may see no dramatic transformation on any single occasion, the vessel of your new self-concept takes form, as surely as clay yields to the patient hands of one who does not abandon the wheel. This leads me to speak of self-concept, for your inner conversation and your self-concept are so intimately woven together that one cannot truly be changed without the other following in its wake. Your self-concept is the underlying assumption you carry about who you fundamentally are, quite apart from any single circumstance, and it is this assumption, more than any isolated event, that determines the general tone of the conversations you habitually rehearse. If somewhere beneath your conscious awareness, you have assumed yourself to be someone who is easily overlooked, easily dismissed, easily taken advantage of, then no matter how carefully you attempt to rehearse a single confident conversation about a single circumstance, that deeper assumption will continually reassert itself in 100 other conversations you have not thought to examine, coloring every exchange with a faint residue of the same old expectation. I ask you then, to look beneath the specific worry that first brought you to seek this teaching, and to ask yourself a deeper question. Who do I secretly believe myself to be? Do I believe myself to be someone for whom ease is natural, or someone for whom struggle is simply the tax paid for existing at all? This is not a question to be answered quickly, in a single moment of forced positivity. It is a question to be lived with quietly over days, watching your own private reactions to small events. The way you might watch the weather over the changing course of a season, noticing patterns rather than isolated incidents. And as you notice the old self-concept revealing itself again and again in 100 small inner conversations you had never before thought to examine, you begin the true work, not of correcting a single circumstance, but of quietly and patiently constructing an entirely new foundation beneath every circumstance yet to come. Now I want to speak of revision, for it is here that you are given the power to reach back, as it were, into the day already lived, and gently alter the very seed that day would otherwise have planted in your deeper mind. You cannot undo the outer event. What is done in the visible world remains done. But the meaning of that event, and more importantly, the feeling with which you continue to carry it forward, is entirely within your power to revise. And this revision, faithfully practiced, changes the seed that event plants for tomorrow, even though it cannot change the soil already disturbed today. If, during your day, you found yourself speaking with anxious hesitation to someone whose opinion of you mattered greatly, do not simply let that anxious exchange stand as the final record of the day. In the quiet of the evening before sleep, revisit that exchange, and this time, imagine yourself speaking with calm, unhurried confidence. Imagine the other person responding with warmth rather than the coolness you may have actually encountered, and feel this revised exchange as vividly as you can, allowing it to become the version your deeper mind acts as the true and lasting impression of the day. This is not, as some might mistakenly believe, a denial of what actually occurred. It is the recognition that what occurred in the outer world was itself only the fruit of an earlier and equally revisable inner conversation, perhaps rehearsed unconsciously days or weeks before the outer event ever took place. And by revising the fruit this evening, you are in truth reaching back to correct the root from which future fruit of the same kind would otherwise continue to grow. The chosen ones of every age, though they were called by many names, monk, mystic, prophet, sage, understood this quiet and private discipline of revision and practiced it faithfully, not as a peculiar habit, but as the simple and natural completion of any day that had not gone entirely as they wished. The way a careful craftsman always inspects his work before setting down his tools for the night, correcting whatever flaw he finds before it can be mistaken, in the morning light, for the finished and permanent form. I want now to speak of faith, for faith is what sustains this entire practice through the long and often silent interval between the rewiring of your inner conversation and the visible appearance of its outer fruit. Faith, properly understood, is not blind hope flung desperately into an uncertain future. It is the settled, felt conviction that what you have assumed within is already, in truth, complete, even though your eyes have not yet been permitted to witness its outer form. Think of the vast night sky, filled with stars whose light left its source so long ago that some of those very stars may no longer exist in the form you now perceive them. And yet you do not doubt the light, simply because its source lies beyond your immediate sight. You trust the light because you understand, however dimly, the nature of its journey. Faith is this same trust extended toward your own inner assumption. This quiet confidence that the conversation you have faithfully rewired within is already, this very night, traveling toward you across whatever distance of time and circumstance separates the unseen from the seen. Let me now draw all of these threads together into a single unified understanding, for I do not want you to leave tonight with a collection of separate techniques applied mechanically and without a living sense of their true unity. Your imagination is the creative power of consciousness itself, and consciousness is the only reality there truly is. Feeling is what gives your imagination its creative force, turning a fleeting thought into a settled assumption. Your inner conversation is the ongoing, habitual expression of that assumption, rehearsed so continuously that it has, until tonight, operated largely outside your awareness, quietly writing your circumstances, the way an unseen author writes the fate of characters who believe themselves entirely free, unaware of the pen moving steadily above them. To live in the end is to rehearse, within that inner conversation, not the striving toward a desired state, but the settled, unremarkable residence within it, already arrived, already secure. The state akin to sleep is the sacred threshold where this rewired conversation sinks deepest, past the vigilant watchman of the analytical mind. Persistence is what allows the new channel to deepen, despite the old channel's continued, habitual pull. Self-concept is the deep foundation beneath every single conversation you will ever rehearse, and revision is your nightly opportunity to correct the record before it hardens into permanent memory. And faith, quiet and settled, is what allows you to trust the unseen journey of your own assumption through the darkness that always precedes its visible dawn. I ask you now, and I want you to answer honestly, in the silence of your own heart, not aloud, not for my benefit, but for your own. If someone could listen this very moment to the private conversation running beneath your conscious thoughts, the murmur that has accompanied you all day today, what would they hear? Would they hear the confident, settled speech of one who has already claimed the state they desire? Or would they hear the anxious rehearsal of old grievances, old fears, old expectations of disappointment, dressed up, perhaps, in the reasonable language of caution and realism? I do not ask this to bring you shame. I ask it because the moment you truly hear that inner conversation for what it is, you can no longer pretend it is simply harmless background noise. You will know, from this night forward, that it has been the true architect of your circumstances all along, and knowing this, you can no longer excuse yourself from the responsibility and the glorious freedom of choosing a new one. Let me give you, now, a practical way to begin this very night, woven not as a separate exercise, but as the natural next step of everything we have already explored together. As you lie down to sleep, instead of allowing your mind to drift wherever habit carries it, choose a single specific conversation related to the very thing you most wish to change, and construct it deliberately with as much sensory detail as you can summon. Feel the texture of the room in which this conversation takes place. Hear the particular tone of voice, warm, easy, no longer strained by fear. Feel your own body relaxed rather than braced, the way a person feels when discussing something entirely settled and beyond dispute. Repeat this same conversation, night after night, not as a chore, but as a comforting return to a place you are steadily making your true home, the way a traveler returning again and again to the same beloved inn along a familiar road, no longer needs to ask directions, for his feet have simply learned the way. And through the day, whenever you catch the old conversation attempting to resume its familiar script, whether it is the anxious rehearsal before a difficult meeting or the bitter replay of an old grievance, gently interrupt it, not with force, but with the calm authority of one who has simply chosen a different subject for discussion. You need not argue with the old conversation. You need only stop feeding it your attention, the way a fire deprived of fuel simply subsides on its own. without any need for water to be thrown upon it in dramatic effort. Let it grow quiet through simple neglect, while you turn your attention, again and again, patiently, toward the new conversation you have chosen to make your dwelling place. I want you to understand, as we draw near to the close of tonight's message, that this rewiring is not a distant, difficult labor requiring years of monastic discipline before any fruit can be tasted. It is available to you this very night, in the same ordinary hours you would have spent regardless, lying in the dark before sleep, walking to your car, waiting for water to boil. The raw material of transformation was never hidden from you in some far-off place requiring pilgrimage or sacrifice to reach. It has been running beneath your own skull, every single day of your life, waiting only for you to notice it, claim authorship of it, and begin deliberately to write a different and far more generous story than the one habit had been writing on your behalf. Think of the sower who went out to sow, scattering seed across every kind of ground, some falling upon the hardened path where it was quickly lost, some among thorns where it was choked before it could mature, and some upon good and welcoming soil where it multiplied beyond measure. I tell you, your own mind contains all of these grounds at once, and it is your habitual inner conversation that determines, moment by moment, which ground receives the seed of any given desire. A desire rehearsed in a conversation of doubt and hurried anxiety falls upon the hardened path, quickly lost beneath the traffic of your own contrary thoughts. A desire rehearsed in a conversation still tangled with old grievances and unresolved fears is choked before it can mature, exactly as thorns choke a young and tender plant. But a desire rehearsed patiently, in a conversation of calm, settled, and persistent feeling, falls upon soil you yourself have prepared through this very practice. And there, I promise you, it multiplies, often far beyond what your original request would have led you to expect. You are, in this very moment, both the sower and the ground, both the author and the character living out the story, both the river and the very stone that river will eventually shape according to its ceaseless and patient flow. This is not a burden I place upon you tonight. It is the deepest freedom you will ever be offered, because if you are indeed the author of this inner conversation, then no external critic, no unfair circumstance, no painful memory from years past holds any final authority over the story yet to be told. You may, this very night, take up the pen you did not realize you had always been holding, and begin, in the quiet privacy of your own mind, a conversation so different from the one that has run for years, that your very circumstances will, in their own perfect time, be startled into a new and unfamiliar shape, simply because the water finally found a different course to follow. I want you to feel, now, the quiet weight of this responsibility, not as a burden, but as the deepest honor a human being can receive. The honor of being, in truth, a co-creator with the very consciousness that fashions all things, seen and unseen. You were never a passive character, wandering through a story authored by fate, by circumstance, by the unfair distribution of fortune among the deserving and undeserving alike. You were and are and always will be the one holding the pen, even in those long years when you did not know it, even in those quiet hours when the old conversation ran on without your awareness, shaping a story you would later call your unfortunate life, when in truth it was simply the story you had, unknowingly, been telling all along. Let this be the night you finally take up that pen with full awareness of what you hold. Let this be the night you listen, perhaps for the first time with true attention, to the conversation that has been running beneath your days, and gently, without shame, without force, begin to offer it new words, new tones, new endings. Let the old conversation of fear and lack and hurried apology fade the way a fading echo fades in a canyon. Finally left in silence, and let the new conversation, spoken quietly and persistently in feeling, become the only voice this canyon knows how to return. My friends, the world is not happening to you, it is happening through you. Tonight, as you lay your head upon the pillow, Dare to assume the feeling of your wish fulfilled. Let the old story fade into silence, and let the new state become your dwelling place. Persist in that feeling, not because you hope it will become true, but because in imagination it is already true. The unseen will become seen, the invisible will become visible, and the state you occupy will become the life you live. Good evening, and may you awaken tomorrow remembering who you truly are.